ceasefire was the word. Corniche al-Mazraya was the answer. Hours after the region was told a pause had begun, bodies were lying in cars and on the pavement at one of Beirut's busiest, mixed residential and commercial intersections. Which means the story did not begin in diplomacy. It began where civilians discovered that a truce on paper could still leave a city open to slaughter. Then came the detail that makes the title impossible to soften. In the rubble were family photos, clothes, and unfinished school homework, the remains of a normal day that had not ended yet when the strikes landed. That is not collateral at the edge of war. That is war entering private life so completely that even childhood gets buried mid-sentence. By the time at least 5 consecutive strikes hit Beirut, the death toll across Lebanon had reached 254, with more than 1,100 wounded. And the ugliest part of the sequence is that some displaced families had already started thinking the word ceasefire might finally mean they could move, maybe even go home. The hope got there first. The bombs followed it in. If you can already feel the gap between the word and the bodies, subscribe now, because that gap is where this channel works. And before we go deeper, tell me what you think the real scandal is here. Was Lebanon cut out of the ceasefire, or was the ceasefire always designed to leave Lebanon bleeding? What made this day more dangerous than a normal air campaign was that even Lebanon's own leadership was publicly saying it was getting mixed signals. One version of reality said Lebanon was part of the ceasefire. Another said it was not. The second, civilians are forced to live between two contradictory maps of danger. The ceasefire itself becomes part of the danger. So here is the question that runs under this whole video. If a ceasefire can be announced and Lebanon can still lose 254 people in a day, what exactly was that ceasefire built to protect? Because whatever the answer is, it was not obvious to the people under the strikes. And once you realize that, the story stops being confusing and starts being obscene. Israel's public line was blunt. The 2-week ceasefire with Iran did not include Lebanon, which meant operations against Hezbollah remained active, even while the wider region was being told de-escalation had begun. Once that exclusion is stated openly, the title stops sounding dramatic. It starts sounding literal. For Lebanon, the ceasefire looked like civilian collapse because it was never really a ceasefire. And that one sentence changes the moral structure of the whole event. Because if Lebanon was openly outside the truce, then civilians were hearing the language of peace while still living inside authorized war. That is not misunderstanding. That is a hierarchy of protection. And Lebanon was sitting underneath it. Deal. Because of Hezbollah, they were not included in the deal. That'll get taken care of too. The contradiction was not buried in rumor or online noise. The strikes were described as the largest coordinated blow across Lebanon since the operation began. And at the same time, the message from the top was that Lebanon was not included because of Hezbollah. So 2 realities were being broadcast together in plain sight. Pause for one arena, open war for another. That is why people click a title like this in the first place. Not because they need another recap of who bombed whom, but because they can already sense when official wording is doing concealment work. The phrase ceasefire suggests protection. The sequence on the ground suggests carve-out, and viewers want the script to say that out loud without flinching. Now, the deeper strategic cruelty comes into view. If Iran respected the ceasefire while Lebanon kept taking strikes, Tehran looked like it had secured a pause for itself while leaving Lebanese allies to absorb the punishment. In that setup, Lebanon was not just a battlefield, it was leverage. And civilians were the material that leverage was made from. That is the layer beneath the bloodiest images. Everyone in this story gains something from the ambiguity except the people under it. One side keeps military freedom, another side preserves diplomatic optics. A third side preserves the right to claim betrayal. Civilians get none of that. They get the consequences of every version at once. Israel said it targeted missile launchers, command centers, and intelligence infrastructure. But in central Beirut, local officials and residents were standing in hit residential areas saying there was nothing military there. That does not automatically prove every strike was unlawful, but it does mean the public justification of military necessity is colliding directly with civilian testimony at the point of impact. And whenever that collision happens, the information war stops being background. It becomes part of the battlefield itself. One side needs the blast to read as precision, the other needs it to read as massacre. The viewer's job is not to join a camp. It is to ask which part is independently visible. And the visible part here is devastating civilian harm in dense urban space. By the end of that day, the language had already moved beyond ordinary condemnation. The killing and destruction were being called horrific, with damage reported near Hiram Hospital and Al-Anabasieh, and another strike hitting an Islamic Health Authority ambulance in Kulayla. Once hospitals and ambulances enter the strike pattern, this is no longer only about explosive power. It is about system damage under fire. And system damage is the real payload of the title. Civilian collapse does not just mean more dead. It means the machinery that keeps the living alive begins to fail. At the same time, not enough ambulances, overwhelmed hospitals, blood shortages, broken roads, unstable shelter networks, and a government still trying to figure out whether its own country was covered by the words being spoken above it. The strike map tells you why the panic spread so fast. Within around 10 minutes, attacks hit at least 48 areas across South Lebanon, the Bekaa, Beirut suburbs, and central Beirut. That kind of pace does not just create casualties, it creates national disorientation. Because no civilian can still believe danger belongs neatly to one district, one sectarian belt, or one military line. This is where weak scripts start sounding like think tank memos and lose the room. But the truth here is more violent than any memo, when dozens of areas are hit in minutes. Panic becomes one of the outcomes. People are not just wounded, their sense of where normal life is still possible gets blown apart at the same speed, and the collapse does not end when the smoke thins. Lebanon was already preparing for the possibility that hundreds of thousands displaced by strikes and evacuation orders might not return home in the long term. Once a government starts planning around mass non-return, you are no longer watching a temporary emergency. You are watching the possible remaking of civilian geography by force. That is the second body count hidden inside this headline. The first count is 254 dead in one day. The second is the number of people still alive but slowly being separated from homes, villages, roads, and futures they may never fully recover. One number shocks the audience. The other one should haunt it. To understand why Lebanon stayed open while the Iran front paused, you have to look beneath the daily strike language and into the war aim taking shape underneath it. The campaign appears to be shifting toward a security zone in South Lebanon. Rather than some quick fantasy of fully disarming Hezbollah by force, that means a longer war logic, a buffer logic, and a map-changing logic all at once. And the moment you see that, the whole ceasefire story mutates. This stops being about a messaging glitch and starts becoming about compatible strategies. A wider pause can coexist with continued pressure on Lebanon if Lebanon is still being treated as unfinished business. In that model, diplomacy does not stop violence. It redistributes where violence is still allowed to work. Here is the most dangerous strategic sentence in the whole story. Pressure like this may degrade Hezbollah, but it can weaken Lebanon's institutions faster than they can recover. In other words, the militia may be the named target, but the state underneath the war may be the thing collapsing first. That is how a campaign against one actor turns into a crisis for an entire country. This is the point where the video has to widen its blast radius or it becomes dishonest. If Lebanon itself is being hollowed out faster than Hezbollah is being neutralized, and then the public is not watching a clean security operation. It is watching a process that can leave the country weaker, emptier, and more breakable, even if Israel gains some tactical outcomes. And this did not happen on a blank moral record. Weeks earlier, white phosphorus had already been documented over homes in Yomor. Another sign that civilian space in Lebanon was already being exposed to a level of risk no one should normalize. So when the public is asked to trust that massive strikes in populated areas are tightly bounded, it is being asked for trust inside a credibility crater. That earlier pattern matters because it changes how the 8th of April should be read, not as one terrible day floating by itself, but as the day the structure became too obvious to disguise. The strike wave did not create the deeper story from nothing. It made the deeper story harder to deny. That is why the unfinished homework has to come back here, not just at the opening. It is not there for sentiment. It is there because it destroys the sterile language of command arrays and infrastructure by dragging the viewer back to where the blast actually landed. Inside domestic time, family time, and childhood time. That one detail carries more truth than a dozen polished briefings. And once that image is in your head, the title locks in all over again. Lebanon's ceasefire looked like civilian collapse because the thing collapsing was not only buildings, it was the public belief that official language still had any duty to line up with civilian reality before people made life or death decisions around it. Go back now to those mixed signals and hear them the way civilians would hear them, not as diplomatic static, but as a brutal practical question. If even the state cannot say for certain whether Lebanon is under a ceasefire umbrella, what exactly are families supposed to trust when they decide whether to move, return, wait, or run? That is not confusion. That is exposure with consequences. And exposure changes behavior before bodies are counted. Some families freeze in shelters. Others start to move, then stop. Others do the worst thing of all and gamble that a political word spoken far above them might finally mean safety where they live. And this is how false hope enters the casualty chain without ever appearing in the official numbers. So bring it back to the number, because the number is the indictment. 254 killed and more than 1,100 wounded in a single day is not background noise around diplomacy. It is the event that tells you how to judge the diplomacy itself. Any ceasefire that can coexist with a day like that must be interrogated as a design, not excused as a messaging failure. This is where softer coverage usually backs away and starts balancing tone before it has delivered the blow. But this title does not allow that luxury. The audience did not click to be talked out of what they can already feel. They clicked to have that feeling named correctly, sharpened, and pushed all the way to its strategic conclusion. And the wider setting makes that conclusion even darker. Before this strike wave hit, Lebanon was already carrying a heavy death toll since the 2nd of March, more than 1 million displaced and repeated evacuation orders, and mounting strain on civilian life. That means the 8th of April did not strike a stable society. It struck a society already bent near breaking point. That is how real collapse works. Not as one cinematic moment, but as cumulative overload that suddenly becomes impossible to deny. Then one day arrives with a number and a sequence so brutal that the entire structure of the war reveals itself in plain view. When at least 48 areas are hit in around 10 minutes, the operational effect is bigger than destruction. It teaches the population that the map can move faster than they can think. By the time one neighborhood believes it understands the pattern, another district is already learning it was wrong. That kind of speed turns uncertainty into a permanent condition of civilian life. And permanent uncertainty is politically useful in war. It drives displacement, thins neighborhoods, and teaches people to self-restrict before anyone has to physically remove them. That is one of the ways a campaign can reshape a country without ever formally redrawing a border on paper. This is why the fight over Lebanon's status inside the ceasefire was never some side dispute for diplomats to clean up later. It exposed the hierarchy of value inside the whole arrangement. If one arena gets the language of stability while another remains available for bombardment, then the excluded arena is functioning as disposable strategic space, no matter how politely anyone tries to phrase it. So now the central question can be answered without hedging. If Lebanon was truly excluded from the ceasefire, then this was not peace failing. It was a regional pause that knowingly left one civilian arena open to continued punishment. And 254 dead is what that exclusion looked like on the ground. If Lebanon was supposed to be included, then the arrangement failed at the first point of contact with reality. That would mean the people selling de-escalation either did not control what mattered most or did not care enough to stop Lebanon from becoming the exception. Either way, the conclusion does not move. Lebanon was not protected by the ceasefire narrative. It was exposed by it. The phrase peace floated above the region, But down on the ground, it translated into bodies. At Corniche al-Mazraya, unfinished homework under rubble, overwhelmed civilian systems, families too uncertain to go home, and a country being taught that even a ceasefire can arrive with a hole cut out where it lives. And that is the one line that should stay lodged in the viewer's gut after this ends, when civilians hear the word ceasefire and still have to guess whether they are inside it. That is not de-escalation. That is abandonment with cleaner branding. Stay with this channel, because we follow the point where the official wording breaks and the real architecture of power starts showing through.